COVID-19 webinar series with Chatham House Distinguished Fellow Professor David Heymann. This week we have with us Jane Halton, the chair of CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and Seth Berkley, the CEO of GAVI, the Vaccines Alliance. They're two of the leaders of Covax, the global initiative that's been set up to ensure that COVID-19 vaccines, when they come online, are fairly distributed in every country around the world. Both Jane and Seth have huge experience in global health governance. Jane has been chair of the board of the WHO, president of the World Health Assembly, and chair of the OECD Health Committee, and 15 years as secretary of the Department of Finance in Australia. Seth is a doctor and an infectious disease epidemiologist, and for almost a decade has been CEO of GAVI, the cornerstone of the multilateral global health architecture that brings vaccines to the world's poorest children. First, the housekeeping stuff. The briefing is on the record, as usual, and questions can be submitted using the Q&A function on Zoom. Please upvote questions if they're close to yours, as those tend to get selected more. So we'll get started now. Welcome, both Seth and Jane. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, great. So we hear a lot of talk about equitable access to vaccines, and countries are saying all the right things. I mean, you ask the pharmaceutical corporations about how they're going to ensure access, and they say GAVI or Covax. The same with governments. Everybody is really getting behind this initiative, but in the next hour, we're hoping to really drill down into the detail and see where's the beef. So Jane, if we could start with you orienting us as to why Covax was set up. Basically, what problem is it trying to address? What's being attempted with Covax, as in what's it aspiring to achieve? And then Seth, if you could then come in on what equitable access really means, practically speaking, how Covax works, what's the system that's been put in place, including what it means to join Covax if you're a rich country or a poor country.
Well, thanks, Emma. And in my end of the world, it's good evening, but to everybody else, good morning. It's a pleasure to talk with people today about what we're doing about vaccines and vaccine access as we still continue to suffer the ravages of the pandemic that's running around the world. And notwithstanding you said that I was 15 years as Secretary of Finance, I wasn't. I was actually 12 and a half years as Secretary of Health in Australia. And I did finance as a finishing off thing. And in that context, as Secretary of Health in Australia, I watched what happened when we had the H1N1 scourge. And we looked at vaccines being basically bought up by the wealthy countries around the world. And there was a real challenge for low to middle income countries and people who just weren't that quick off the mark in terms of ensuring that their populations, and particularly vulnerable people in those countries, could access vaccine. And so when CEPI was formed, it was formed fundamentally because, firstly, in order to distribute a vaccine, you need to have a vaccine. And we were worried about a number of pathogens for which there was no vaccine. And actually, coronavirus was one of them. But importantly, when this whole series of events started, there were conversations amongst a small number of us who had had that experience of H1N1, who've been around this world for a long time. And we said, this is a novel virus. It would be a truly terrible thing if, in fact, what we've seen historically were to happen again. How is it we can generate enough global solidarity to ensure that people around the world can get access in a way that is equitable, as you've said, when a vaccine is available? And hence the idea of Covax was born. And then Seth and I have spent many long hours working with some fantastic people who've been doing the heavy lifting on the design of the mechanism. And then we've been delighted that we've had nearly 190 countries join. But the whole objective is to secure enough capacity in this market to actually ensure that we can distribute vaccines, not just to wealthy countries who've already taken out contracts, but actually to countries right around the world, so we can actually target those who are most vulnerable as early as is possible. Thanks, Emma.
Emma, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jane. Go ahead, Seth.
So, as always, Jane has done a great job starting that introduction. And let me go to the last vaccine that we had to deal with, which was Ebola. And the problem with Ebola was that there was no real market for it because, of course, it was a disease of very poor populations and in very small numbers, usually in very isolated communities. And obviously, the outbreak in 2014-15 was different because it went into urban areas and obviously threatened the world with spread. So our work there was to try to make sure that there was a market, that manufacturers, if they made a vaccine, it would get purchased. So what's interesting here is this is the opposite problem in a sense, as Jane has framed it. Here we have a market that is truly global and with countries with vast resources who want access to the product. And yet we know with a global pandemic, you're only safe if everyone's safe. So if you did have a small amount of vaccine that was used in wealthy countries, you would not have the outcome we need, which is to dampen down the epidemic globally. In fact, there was an interesting study that looked at if you took 2 billion doses of vaccine and you distributed it to 50 countries, you would reduce deaths about 30%. If you took those 2 billion doses of vaccines and distributed to high-risk populations across all countries, you would reduce it by more than 60%. So, when, as Jane has described, when we began to look at this, we said, okay, the developing countries are a critical priority because they will not have market access. But so are countries that are upper middle income and countries that are high income that may not have a full portfolio of vaccines. And that's a critical point because you don't want one vaccine because that's playing a game of lottery. If you're successful, that's great. But if you're not, then you're at the back of the queue. So you really need a portfolio of products. And that's where the idea for Covax came. So to your question, if you're an AMC country, and that's the 92 countries that we've included in that, and that's advanced market commitment, those countries are eligible based upon World Bank classification. It's low income, lower middle income, and also a small number of small economies that are IDA eligible. For the other countries, and that's the 95 countries that have chosen to join, they are self-financing. And the idea there is that they provide support for the vaccines, but they use the facility to help get access to vaccines and have an actively managed portfolio. Equitable access for us means that it gets out to developed and developing countries at the same time, and that the portfolio is shared among all countries. Of course, practically speaking, this will be the largest rollout of vaccines in history. And therefore, it doesn't mean that every single person everywhere in the world is going to get it at the same time, but that what we're doing is changing the strategy globally to try to make this happen.
Okay, thank you, Seth and Jane, for that great introduction. I wanted to turn to David now to ask you, David, how unprecedented is this? And what are the key features that make this such a leap forward, if it is? And I mean, is there another systematic approach out there at the moment that rivals this?
Thanks, Emma. Well, Jane will know better because she was greatly involved in the H5N1 influenza outbreaks back in 1997. At that point in time, when people began to get infected with a new influenza virus, it was clear that there wasn't production capacity in the world to deal with a world of, back then, about 7 billion people to get the vaccine developed and out to those people. And at the same time, this disease continued to spread in poultry and then occasionally in humans, and it was a threat as a potential pandemic. And so what happened was that countries in Asia, which had been freely sharing the H5N1 virus with WHO, tried to get this vaccine, and they found that it had already been bought up by industrialized countries in advanced market commitments. So they couldn't get the vaccine when they needed it. So there was an attempt to stop sharing viruses from Asian countries, in particular from Indonesia, while asking for more equitable access to the vaccines that were developed from these viruses. And so through a series of discussions, intergovernmental meetings at the World Health Organization, there was a framework set up, which was called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, to which industry committed some percentage of their vaccine to WHO to provide to first line workers should there be a pandemic, those first line workers around the world. This was set up, it's been shown to be a mechanism which can work. It's gotten investment from pharmaceutical companies, not only in agreements to provide vaccine, but in funding to WHO to continue the necessary surveillance of influenza around the world. And this mechanism is dedicated to influenza. So the Covax is just a follow-on to this. With Jane's experience and with Seth's experience with the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework moving forward.
But is this at all unprecedented then in the scale or the attempt to distribute and allocate globally? Are you saying there's not much of a leap forward from this flu vaccine thing?
There's a great leap forward because there's a lot of pre-planning now that didn't go on with the pandemic influenza preparedness. This is at a time when it's really crucial to have this vaccine. And one of the issues that came up with the pandemic influenza preparedness framework was the fact that many countries had legislation which, if they had a producer of vaccine in their country, they couldn't export it until they had satisfied domestic needs. So all of these things are playing into Covax, and I'm sure Covax is dealing with those issues.
Yeah, Jane, Seth, do you want to come in? Do we still have that kind of legislation where they physically can't share?
Well, so I mean, David's very right in orienting us, and he's right also that I spent several years of my life chairing the global negotiations on the PIP framework, which it finally did result in what was a landmark agreement. But this Covax facility is categorically a significant step forward. I mean, it's something which is much more than was envisaged in the PIP framework. And to the question, there are still challenges, as we know, in some countries, where not only can there be legislation, but there's also just the capacity to put on export bans. And many of our audience will have heard the discussion about vaccine nationalism. And certainly I started talking about this in February as being one of the real concerns we had, because, and Seth has really, I think, adroitly oriented us to that study, which demonstrates the really significant impact you have in loss of life if we equitably vaccinate the vulnerable around the world, as opposed to targeting vaccines on a country by country basis. But for some domestic governments, this can be a hard choice to make. So yes, we still have those challenges, and short of, can I put it this way, the embarrassment factor, we can't override domestic legislation or political will in an individual country. But what we are doing this time is throwing a very, very stark light on that kind of behaviour. And because, as Seth has already outlined, we are actually putting in place these kinds of purchasing arrangements, it actually does mean that we have the capacity to actually acquire and then distribute vaccine far earlier in a way that is equitable. And as Seth has said, not just to low to middle income countries, but to many upper middle income countries, who basically don't have any other capacity to spread their bets across a portfolio. So this will be, we are very optimistic, a much more equitable approach. There will still be problems though with those kinds of circumstances that we can't change, but this is a leap ahead of huge proportion.
So Seth, I wanted to ask you, with poorer countries or less lower income countries that are in Covax that you said are eligible, what does that mean? Where is the money coming from them? Are you buying the vaccines for them and giving it to them? Or are you negotiating cheaper prices for them? And who pays for them for those countries?
So first of all, let me just add one more point to what Jane said, which I think was very important. And that is that, yes, there was an agreement put together. Obviously, the test of agreements is what happens in a crisis. And I think that's really the point. But if you look at the many things that were not resolved, and they're trivial things, but they are really important. Is there regulatory harmonization, or do we need to go to 200 separate countries, regulators, and get approval of products? Do we have standardized labeling so that a product can be used in South Africa or in India, or do we have to have them labeled for each individual location? Do we have indemnification and liability for manufacturers? These are things that have happened in previous pandemics and have not been resolved. Can we track and trace vaccines? So one of the things we're trying to do in this case, because it's global, taking advantage of the crisis, is to try to resolve many of these issues, which will have implications for this period, but also going forward. Now, to answer your, and by the way, going forward, because it's evolutionarily certain, this is not the last one, we're going to have more outbreaks. So, but going directly to your question, for the AMC countries, the idea is that they are eligible for official development aid. And so we have begun a process. We began that at the Global Vaccine Summit the UK hosted in June, where we opened up an advanced market commitment. We received some financing there, but we had a preliminary goal of $2 billion by the end of 2020 to try to jumpstart some of the doses. And we announced at the Paris Peace Forum last week that we've exceeded that number. And we're now looking for a larger amount of finance that actually would purchase those vaccines. We are asking countries to cost share, which is the normal GAVI experience, but if they don't have the money to cost share, we will not have that be a barrier for them to engage. But the other good news is that the multilateral development banks have also stepped in now. The World Bank announced a $12 billion package for vaccines, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, others are working on this. And so the idea is to build a set of finances that can help countries get access to vaccines. The last thing I'd say is that we are now driving ahead. In fact, we have a meeting later today with all of the countries to have countries do the planning work that's necessary to do this unprecedented rollout. And what that entails is bespoke plans for each country, because the first group to get vaccinated, probably health workers, but then high-risk groups. What are the high-risk groups in their situation? Is it the elderly? Is it comorbidities? Is it refugees? Is it people living in urban slums? What's the state of their cold chain, their supply chain? What type of help do they need? So the GAVI board put $150 million to jumpstart that process. And now we're working with countries to try to do that preparation, so then we know how much resources they need to build up their systems to be able to deliver, because immunization is the most widely distributed intervention and there is a system, but obviously that system is not for the elderly or people with comorbidities, et cetera. So we really are in unprecedented space here.
And I wanted to ask you about this in the context of solidarity, because we've heard a lot about the need for global solidarity. It's a refrain from Dr. Tedros, and not a great report card on solidarity. But how do you see Covax in terms of an expression of solidarity in the pandemic? I mean, the rich countries that can compete on their own, why are they in this? Because it's the right thing to do for solidarity, or is there something else in it for them that's motivating them? And what's in it for pharma? And do you think this is an expression of solidarity, or is that really a distraction?
As Jane described, every political leader has a responsibility to take care of its population. So you can interpret that two ways. You can say, I'm just going to take care of my people and I don't care. But in a pandemic, that does not take care of the problem. So you have to, even if you're taking care of your people, is making sure that there is availability of vaccine and damping down the pandemic globally. So I think that's one critical motivation that's there. For high-income countries who have joined the facility, part of it is for support, but part of it is also insurance, because many high-income countries have one or two vaccines, and if those work, that's great, but if they don't, then they're at the back of the queue. So by being part of COVAX, they have the largest portfolio of vaccines, and we will pivot that portfolio as new vaccines become available, as science moves forward. And then, the last part of this is That we call, by the way, insurance in terms of thinking about that. The last part of your question relates to pharmaceutical companies. And I think they, first of all, vaccine manufacturers are a little different. They're kind of public health people in disguise. They understand that these are tools for prevention. They want the world to be prevented. The challenge in the past has been that they haven't had the systems and ways to do it. And so we're trying to put that in place. But they also understand, they're global companies. And if all of a sudden the vaccines are just available in 20 high-income countries and 180 countries have no access to them, that's not going to be good for business going forward. It's not good for public health, and they will be criticized. So there are lots of incentives, both positive and some carrots and some sticks, to have them engage with this. And they've been part of the process. We have the IFPMA and that's the international vaccine manufacturers and the developing country manufacturers as part of COVAX, working hand in glove with us on trying to make sure that we can get to the 2 billion doses by the end of 2021 that we're trying to do.
And can I support that, Emma? Can I support that? I think this is actually truly a global partnership. And I think it's important to underscore that we can't do what we are doing with COVAX without, firstly, the countries, obviously, without people who will both self-finance and donate, but also working cooperatively with our colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry. And CEPI's been privileged to be able to assist with funding a number of these vaccine candidates, and that does give us some leverage. But in truth, the cooperation that we're getting from the vaccine manufacturing sector goes beyond that. And I do think, as Seth rightly says, this issue of public health people in disguise, but also rightly concerned about reputation. They have been criticised in the past, and I cannot let this pass without acknowledging that we have had really good cooperation, not just from them, but from regulators and a whole series of other groups. But this cooperation is really necessary at this time.
Thank you, Jane. David, I wanted to turn to you first, but also Seth and Jane, but David first. And that is, a lot of people are putting a lot of expectations on COVAX to come through and really deliver for us on this desire for equitable access. Now, what do you think, for the purposes of expectation management, what do you think we should expect to achieve in reality beyond the vision, the intention, and over what time frame? I guess what I'm really asking is that if at the end of the day, in a couple of years, when we look back on this and there still wasn't quite equitable distribution, does that mean COVAX was a complete failure and a disaster? Or what do you think is reasonable to expect of COVAX?
Well, COVAX is certainly necessary today, and it's a new way of working globally, which is extremely important. My hope is that the transition team in the US for the presidency continues to look at COVAX as something that the US should belong to, because to present there's not been a strong presence of the US in the COVAX initiative. So I hope that that solidarity will continue to grow and include some of the world's, most of the world's important economies. At the same time, the COVAX facility is located within the ACT Accelerator, which is also important because it's making available other interventions that are extremely useful and important in the pandemic, including diagnostic tests and eventually therapeutics. And those diagnostic tests are going out now to countries where they haven't been able to do the expensive PCR testing. They're doing other types of testing called antigen testing with rapid diagnostics. And that also is a way of dealing with this pandemic. So vaccines are extremely important, and COVAX is a very important initiative moving forward. It will be one of the tools in the toolbox of vaccine, because as it appears now, this infection could become endemic, could remain in human populations or in some animal populations going forward. It's not yet, the destiny is not yet clear, but that's one of the scenarios. And therefore we need all of these different tools in the toolbox. And a vaccine will be very important in preventing mortality, we hope, and in other areas of the work, but we need to have all of these tools together. in addition to this Covax initiative, which, as I said, is really very, very important for global solidarity.
Okay, but can I just squeeze out of you an answer to what should we expect in reality for it to achieve, as opposed to the vision and the intention?
Well, I wish I could tell you what we could expect, but I believe the vision of people like Jane and Seth moving forward will take this another step to more equitable distribution of vaccine. And if the funding comes in, which we believe it will, everybody believes that, if that funding does come in, then I think COVAX will have taken another step forward in a more equitable world, which is what we all need to strive for, not just during this pandemic, but as has been done for other vaccines, get these to the people who really need them.
Well, Seth and Jane, I'd love you to add something on what standard we should be holding you to expectation-wise of what COVAX is going to be able to deliver in reality.
Well, first of all, to David's point, thinking about equity is critical. GAVI was set up, and the UK, by the way, is the single largest supporter of GAVI. We've introduced 496 new vaccines in developing countries, and the vaccination rates are at the highest level in history. So, I mean, there is a track record of moving towards equitable access. In fact, the problem we have now is low-income countries have coverage that sometimes exceeds high-income countries, and the middle-income countries that aren't GAVI eligible are way behind. And we're actually in the process of looking, can we help there? So that's for other vaccines. For COVAX, we already have acquired rights to 700 million doses. That's public information, plus lots of options for more. Plus, we're in the midst of a series of other deal making. And as you heard, using the same group, the alliance of WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank, civil society, US CDC, et cetera, we're in the process of helping countries get ready to receive those vaccines. So there will be delivery of vaccines. Now, the last question, and people will judge on this, is, will it be exactly at the same time or not? And part of that depends. What happened, the first vaccine that was announced that had preliminary efficacy trial was a vaccine that needed to be stored at minus 80 degrees. We are now asking countries, do you want that vaccine? We know we can deliver minus 80 vaccines. The Ebola vaccine we delivered in DRC in the middle of a war zone was a minus 80 vaccine, but it's expensive, it's complicated, it takes a lot of training, it may be a distraction. So, it may be that countries may say, well, we'll want to wait for a vaccine that maybe is more temperature stable or easier to use for us. Is that a failure, or is that a smart decision by the country? I think those are the issues we're going to have to do. But there will be Ebola, there will be COVID-19 vaccines available for developing countries to roll out across a whole range of the portfolio, and we'll see how that plays out in countries, including, by the way, there is a small humanitarian buffer as part of that 2 billion doses. We talk about up to 5%, 100 million doses. And so that's available for, situations where, we have to vaccinate groups that are not necessarily recognized by countries or in acute humanitarian crises as well.
Jane, did you want to add anything before I go on to the next?
No. I think that was what we might describe as a thoroughly comprehensive answer.
Okay, great. So I wanted to get to this issue of doses, and I'm sure you'll each have a view on this, but that is your thoughts on what impact you think there might be on equitable global access of rich countries buying up vaccine through bilateral deals with producers. I mean, does it matter? Is it hypocritical? Can it work for both to be going on? Will there be enough doses to go into the COVAX pool? Seth, you mentioned the 700 million doses. I read something somewhere that the US, EU, and UK, just those three together, have secured 4.8 billion doses so far to your 700 million. And that scientists are warning that there may not be enough to go around, and developing countries may still be left behind. Is this in the way? How do we work with this? Is there anything we can do about it? Who wants to go first on that?
Maybe I'll say a word. Seth said it earlier that countries do have an obligation to their own people. This is clear. These are elected governments in many countries. And those countries have a responsibility to the people who've elected them. And so this causes this tension between satisfying national need, because it's a sovereign country which has elected their government, which is to protect them, and the global need. And that's why this Covax is so important, because it's dealing with both of these in a new way. And I just can't say enough about how important this really is. And I'll stop talking now and let the two who are working with it more closely speak up at this point. But remember, there is an obligation of governments, as Seth said, to be providing for their own populations.
So yeah, and let me follow on from that, if I might. We can't, and actually would not try to fetter national governments. I mean, there's no point. They're going to do what they do. What we can, however, do is have as much, and I describe this in a rather colloquial way, we can have enough financial muscle in the procurement market to be essentially the equivalent of a large financial player, which means we can actually get access to those vaccines on effectively equal terms with the people who would, because they have the wherewithal, the financing and the foresight and the political will to go and put these arrangements in place. So I think this is the point. Brought together, all of these countries, low to middle income countries who, as Seth has indicated, are eligible in respect of GAVI activities normally, but also other countries for a variety of reasons, be it insurance, be it their size, be it their sophistication in these purchasing arrangements, for whatever reason, bounded together, they actually have a much better chance of getting access in a way which they probably wouldn't otherwise. And so essentially what we've done is we've shifted the dial on this commercial negotiation using Covax in that way to recognize it's a market and there are governments who have responsibilities. So we have bounded together a group of people basically for reasons of insurance, enlightened self-interest and need in a way that we have never seen before. And yes, particularly countries that have manufacturing onshore and have significant wherewithal, they've put in place those arrangements. But in the past, all these countries in these circumstances I've outlined would be literally at the back of the queue, and that is not the case this time. And as Seth has rightly said, we are already in a position to talk to countries who are part of the Covax family to say, these very low temperature mRNA vaccines, do you have the capacity? Would you like to be considered for those? In some cases, the answer will be yes. And as Seth says, because they've experienced this with Ebola vaccine. In some cases, they'll say, no, we'll wait. That is their choice. And this is, for those who've ever played that awful game Tetris, this is like a giant game of Tetris. So working out what vaccine will work and where it will work and the nature of how the vaccine works together with who's in which particular circumstance. But we've never been in this position before. And that is why this is so different. So, no, we're not going to stop those other countries, but let's be clear. The sovereign country that has put in place 2 pre-purchase arrangements, I describe this as being like Clint Eastwood in that movie. Do you feel lucky? Because your choice may not work. And that's the point. For once, many, many, many more countries are in exactly the same position as each other. And that's what's encouraging solidarity, in my view.
So Emma, let me just add at one point, and just to say that it's also not easy, because when we started negotiations with manufacturers, you know, there had been this big push from some of the wealthiest countries in the world to build this portfolio up. So, you know, they say to us, okay, well, we did this deal with, say, the US government, and, you know, you guys should do the same deal. And we have to say, honestly, we have all these countries, we have money from those countries, we have money from donors, but we don't have the US Treasury behind us, or the British, the Treasury behind it, or others. And so there has been a process of trying to work to make sure that the deals that are put together make sense for those countries. And that is a challenge. Now, you know, the other thing we didn't know when we started was whether any of these vaccines are going to work. And so, the logical thing was to build a very big portfolio of lots of different things. We've now seen, in the last 2 weeks, 2 examples of early data. It's not, not comprehensive and looking at all groups, et cetera, but we're seeing promising data from at least one class of vaccines. It may be that it's easier to produce vaccines, and therefore there may be a higher percentage of vaccines that succeed. Normally, the success rate of vaccines historically is less than 10% preclinical and less than 20% clinically. So if that's the case, you would need very large numbers of potential candidates to have the successes you want. If it turns out that it's much easier for this vaccine and we get high success rates, then there will be a lot more doses available, because the way we've dealt with this is not just buying from multilateral companies, so multinational companies, but also by doing technology transfers to developing country manufacturers who have the ability to produce very large volumes. So what that does is not only says we want some slice of the pie that exists normally, but we're increasing that pie by getting other manufacturers in here to produce large amounts of vaccine. And that's how we'll get to, originally, we were thinking we need 4 billion doses to get to 2 billion doses, because a lot of them are going to fail. Of course, maybe now we'll need 3 billion doses to get to 2 billion doses. That science is going to change as we understand, as different vaccines come through, how effective they are. And most important is how effective they are for different subpopulations, because we need vaccines that work in the elderly, which traditionally is difficult. We need vaccines that work in immunosuppressed populations, in people with other chronic diseases, in pregnant women, et cetera, et cetera. And that may not be the same vaccine everywhere.
Okay, before I thank you for that. Before I move on to the audience questions, I just had one more on allocation. So say there is a really suitable, universally suitable vaccine that everybody wants, that hasn't got complications on storage or whatever, that is, suitable in all environments, and it's in the Covax pool. What is the mechanism for deciding? How are you going to decide who gets that? Everybody wants it, and is it the poorest countries will get it first? The ones with the largest infections will get it first? People who've paid more will get it first? How is that physically going to happen to decide who's getting out of that pool at what time?
So the way that is set up is WHO has set up an allocation mechanism, and that's been discussed with all the member states. And as you know, that is the vast majority of the world's population. The idea there is to use a set of algorithms, but then also to have an independent group that will look to make sure that the rules are being followed. The idea was to have 2 pools, one for self-financing countries and one for the Covax AMC. And within those pools, then one does the distribution, based upon this principle of trying to get vaccines out everywhere. Now, why do we have to think about it slightly differently? There may be countries that are not ready for vaccines, or don't have need more help in the supply chain or in storage, or, so it may be that other factors will affect the distribution of those vaccines. But if there was none of those factors, the idea would be that they would be distributed at an equal speed. Of course, there's going to be other things. If you're a small Pacific island, you may not give a slice of their population because it may be very small doses. You might give a bigger allocation of vaccine because of the difficulties of getting it there and doing it. So there will be practical considerations, but basically the idea is to try to have that allocation be fair across all countries.
Okay, and one last addition to that is, will Covax be able to control, once the vaccine is given to a country, who gets it, that the allocation of what is envisioned, say, health workers first or the vulnerable, that it actually goes to those people? For, say, in countries with, less than perfect governance and accountability records, is Covax doing anything about that, or can you do anything about that? Will you be monitoring and evaluating whether the vaccines go to the people they were intended for, instead of being diverted?
No and yes. So they're sovereign countries. We can't tell them, we can't force them to do something. But to get vaccine, you have to apply. And in that application, if you say, I want to take the vaccine and just give it all to school children and not vaccinate anybody at risk or anybody else, that the independent review of that vaccine will say, well, this is not following WHO guidelines. Maybe you need to rethink this and put epidemiology in your application that proves that's the right use for it. So there are some checks in intention, but once the vaccine's in country, they will do what they're going to do. The challenge we have, though, is I think with education, and the best example of this is DRC. Practical example, we were very worried. Here's a country at war, here's, lawlessness, all of these things going on. The vaccine got used. Were there a few people who got vaccinated who didn't need it? Maybe, but most of the vaccine got used to focus on the contacts of people who were infected, on health workers, on trying to stop the epidemic. And in that case, it was a clinical trial. So we actually knew every single person that got vaccinated. And, in essence, in one of the most difficult situations in the world, people did the right thing and got the vaccines to people who need it. That's what we expect should happen in the vast majority of countries.
And can I just add to that? I mean, I do think and look, yes, as Seth says, there's a risk. And no, we cannot bind and watch every single dose of vaccine that's administered. But if you think about the straight epidemiology of what's going on with this pandemic, we know where the most death is. We know where the most challenge is in terms of people who are exposed to large amounts of virus. And if you actually want to give confidence to your population, if you want your economy to operate again in the way that you wish, if you want to be open for trade and travel and all those things, you would logically, in national interest, direct a vaccine to those who are most vulnerable, because that actually is what will bring the acute phase of this pandemic to an end. And I'm aware of very few countries who ultimately don't want their country to prosper and their citizens to prosper. So exactly as Seth said, when we were actually doing our trials on the Ebola vaccine in the DRC, exactly as he said, it went where it should have gone by and large. So I feel optimistic about that. Now, I'm not naive, but I do think there's a coincidence of interest here, which should lead to the right people being vaccinated.
Emma, I might just also give an experience with meningitis vaccine, which was the same thing. And that sort of encompasses what Jane and Seth have been saying. Back in the 1990s, late 1990s, there was a shortage of meningitis vaccine. And MSF, Doctors Without Borders, UNICEF, WHO, and the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies were all fighting to get this vaccine to give to countries. They bound together, they created a large market, they got the vaccines, and they distributed them to countries that provided to them a virtual plan, which they would review overnight and provide the vaccine. And those countries followed that plan. They got the vaccine to where it was needed. So countries do have a will to get these vaccines out, and this will work.
And that mechanism, by the way, is still being used for not just meningitis, but for cholera, for yellow fever, and we just actually extended it for Ebola. So, the point is there is experience on this.
Okay, great. Thank you so much on that. I'm going to move to audience questions. And the first question is from Alona Kickbush, and that is, what about Russian and Chinese vaccines? Who wants to take that?
Well, hello, Alona. Hello, Alona. How are you? Good to hear from you. So essentially, Covax is considering a range of vaccines in terms of the portfolio. CEPI has certainly considered a range of candidates in terms of its funding. There's a very rigorous process of considering vaccine candidates. And indeed, if there is a competent regulatory authority who we think is going to be in a position to approve a vaccine, we're open to considering all kinds of vaccines. Now, we already know, certainly in terms of the portfolio, there are things that CEPI's funded, but it's not limited to CEPI-funded vaccines. And we already know some of the early results that look promising. And clearly, depending on when others come forward and if their results are promising, and if there is an expert regulator who, together with the WHO, considers that that vaccine is viable, those will be considered very definitely.
And if I can just add, there is a procurement that was launched by UNICEF, and that is open to all manufacturers. And to do that, they have to submit data. And of course, as Jane has said, what we're interested in here is transparency and trials that are done to the highest standards, and to make sure the vaccines are both safe and efficacious before we would consider them after having WHO pre-qualification. So there's many different checkpoints that are required here. We are working with countries, including the two countries you specifically described. And by the way, China is part of Covax and is engaged with it, at this current time. But we are also asking the question: are there countries that may have difficulties due to language or due to having certain laboratory assays or whatever that limits their ability to do some of these activities? And then can we, through WHO or through CEPI or through other mechanisms, provide assistance to make it possible that they can compete on a level playing field?
Thank you for that. The next question upvoted is from Michelle Remmers, and this is about the three vaccines we've heard about recently: the Pfizer BioNTech news yesterday, and last week the Moderna news on Monday, and reports of the phase 2 data on the AstraZeneca Oxford trial. Where do you see timelines for distribution now? Where are the bottlenecks as you see them, assuming the best case scenario of approval of the above three vaccines as well as the J&J vaccine? Who knows about that? Anybody?
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, Seth can extend on this. Look, certainly, I think everyone is saying, notwithstanding what might happen in respect of emergency use provisions, and it is certainly reported that there will be consideration to some of that in the United States fairly shortly. I mean, we're not talking about widespread distribution this year, probably first quarter, more likely second quarter of next year. I mean, essentially, there's still a distance to go in respect of a number of these, and there's both the process of regulatory consideration, but then, of course, there's the manufacturing distribution piece. So much as everyone would like this problem to be solved in the first quarter of next year, I think being realistic, and I know, for example, AstraZeneca are looking at distributed manufacturing around the world, and that will certainly speed up access. But that's not going to happen in the next 5 minutes. So certainly first half of next year, I would be quite confident about. First quarter of next year, I think, is a stretch.
Okay.
Let me just bring some reality into the discussion as well. And what countries do with these vaccines will depend on what these vaccines do. And we don't know yet. We know that they can prevent serious illness. We don't know whether they can also prevent infection. And we don't know if they do prevent infection, if the virus can still be carried in the nasal passages and be transmitted that way. So there's a lot to be known about these vaccines, and that will then make it possible for the Covax initiative to really determine how much vaccine they need for each of these different types of vaccine. Because if it only prevents serious illness, it may be used in a different population than if it actually prevents infection with the virus.
And let me just let me come in on that if I can, because the other issue, as I mentioned before, is the different at-risk groups, the elderly and others. So those subgroup analyses are important. But the other thing to think about, the first two vaccines that announced results are mRNA vaccines. They have special handling characteristics. They're novel. They've never been approved before. So working through the regulatory systems, how stable they'll be. And then they are more expensive because the manufacturing is not well distributed. So those are issues. They will be produced in smaller quantities. Then we get to AstraZeneca, which is a more conventional vaccine, although again, this particular chimp adeno vaccine has not yet been approved either, but that class of vaccines, there is experience, and as David has said, there's more widespread manufacturing. There also are vaccines that are coming a little bit later that have characteristics that may make them, for example, single dose vaccines, which would be a very attractive characteristic. And there are other vaccines that have very, very high immunologic response that may be good in the elderly. So one of the challenges is going to be, as we learn about science, as we understand the simplicity of manufacturing, to get a sense of what the right balance is of these different products.
Thank you all for that. The next question is directed specifically to David, and it's from Damien Chunilal. For David, if the supply of vaccines in a given developed country is limited, who should be prioritized in receiving the vaccines first within this country? We have read many different views. I'd like to hear what David thinks.
Well, Seth has already said that countries will make their own decisions, but certainly it will depend on what the vaccine does as to where it will be used. And if you're trying to stop transmission in the country and you have a vaccine that prevents infection, then you would use that in the populations that are at greatest risk of getting infected, because that would decrease the transmission among all populations. If, however, it's a vaccine that only works in preventing serious illness, then you'd want to target a different group, and that would be a group that has serious consequences, including those people who are obese and those people who have comorbidities. So it will depend on the vaccine, but in general, you want to give that vaccine where epidemiologically it makes the most sense based on what that vaccine does. Seth may want to add a little bit more, but that's my view.
And just to say that WHO has and will continue through its SAGE, that's the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts, they will continue to look at both the vaccines and the epidemiology as we learn about it. And the truth is, we still don't understand. This is a fairly novel, virus. We don't know, can you get infected a second time? How long will immunity sustain over time? And then, if you were to look at the US, you might say, well, some high-risk groups are meatpacking plants and prisons and nursing home staff. What's the equivalent for that in South Sudan or in other countries? What are the epidemiologic groups you'd have to think about? So we need to really have, as I said, some type of bespoke country planning, but it needs to be based upon some guidelines on the vaccine, what it does, but also what we understand about risk groups and epidemiology.
The next one is from Julie Futrell. It's an upvoted question. How does this work for countries that are effectively failed states, e.g. Libya, Iraq, and ones with civil war, such as Syria?
We deliver in many of the most difficult countries in the world. It is not easy. I mean, we have to be honest about that. We work with the state actors, we work with the non-state actors. Sometimes we can be transparent about that, sometimes we cannot, but the idea is to try to get vaccine to everybody because we believe that all lives are equal, and so that's what we try to do. And so working with the humanitarian community, working with WHO, UNICEF, and others, we already have programs to do this, and we will build on those. I mean, for example, when Syria got to a particularly severe state, even though it wasn't financially eligible, the board made a special dispensation. Eventually, the tragedy was the epidemic brought it down into GAVI eligibility economically. But in that case, we've been working with them to not only make sure there are vaccines, but to also help rebuild the systems that the war had broken down. Similarly, in places like Yemen, in Somalia, in DRC, we just talked about. So it is possible to do, but it's certainly peacetime is a much better time to deliver vaccines than is wartime, and good governance makes it much easier than bad governance, but we'll do the best we can.
Challenging environments. The next most upvoted question is from Axel Lambert de Rouvois. How does Covax plan to deal with pharmacovigilance for adverse events and, crucially, product liability?
So maybe I'll start on that, if I might. Well, certainly pharmacovigilance is something that we are spending quite a bit of time on. I think Seth has already mentioned our objectives, which are to deal with a range of issues that have been hitherto difficult to handle, labelling, regulatory approaches, but pharmacovigilance, and particularly this issue in relation to compensation arrangements. I can't say that we've got all the answers yet. What I can tell you is that this is very much a work in progress in terms of the discussions that we're having, particularly on the pharmacovigilance and the essentially whether or not we can have an insurance arrangement to actually cover those matters. It's complicated. In fact, we only had a conversation about this issue. Was it only last night, my time, Seth? I think it was 24 hours ago. So whilst I can't tell you we've got everything locked up and nailed, we are very, very much alert to those issues, and I think showing promising signs in terms of the development. But Seth might want to provide some more details.
Just say something on the pharmacovigilance, and I'll just give you a funny story, because I presented to the board, as I always do, a couple of board meetings ago, and I put up a slide and I said, look, here's the reports of adverse events following immunization, and you can see that they've been increasing. And initially the people said, oh my God, does that mean that something's wrong? And I said, no, it's great news, because we've enhanced working with WHO pharmacovigilance, and it's really critical. So like with polio, where you want to know there is paralysis that is not polio, and you use that as an indicator that you actually have a good surveillance system, we are doing that with pharmacovigilance as well. And that's really important with novel vaccines in novel populations. So it is being built, as Jane said. It's not perfect yet, but there is a system in place, and we will have to strengthen that, and that's going to be an important part of what we do. And as Jane said, the indemnification and liability has been a big challenge. We're trying to solve that, but as you can imagine, that's quite complicated.
Indeed. So maybe we can fit in one more audience question before we round up, and that will be, what am I going to pick? What's being done in the context of Covax in relation to increasing vaccine hesitancy? An age-old question, and one that's got a lot of discussion, but what is physically being done to prepare for that? And do we need to get on top of this before the rollout of vaccines? And how are we doing that?
Well, again, this is an issue that has been discussed, and I think we are blessed that we have at our disposal a series of people who are basically global experts to work with. People like Hardy Larson, who's very well known. This is an issue of great concern to the WHO. So again, can we unilaterally solve this as a problem? No, we can't. I think we're all very alive to the misinformation that we see currently on social media platforms. And I know that the social media platforms are attempting to deal with those things, but it will come down a lot to leadership in countries. And we are certainly discussing how we might work with them to provide assurances. I have to say, I've done an awful lot of media interviews in Australia. One of the issues that always comes up is vaccine hesitancy, and I talk about how these issues should be resolved, and for individuals who are concerned, what they should do now to go and seek advice, to get assurance, etc. So will we unilaterally solve this problem? No, we won't. Is it very much on the agenda of the Covax group? Yes, it is. And I would be confident, particularly working with our experts, that we will make the best fist of it that we can.
Just to finish off, David, the vaccine hesitancy you've all got a lot of experience with vaccine campaigns, but for David, do you think it is particularly vibrant at the moment in this pandemic? Is it highlighting it, or is this pretty routine level that you're seeing that really isn't very surprising?
Emma, what's important is that our political leaders start to talk realistically about what is and is not possible with a vaccine. And until the present, unfortunately, many political leaders have seized on vaccine as the solution, and they've suppressed their economies in order to wait for a vaccine. People are now waiting for a vaccine, and hopefully it will be a vaccine that will not disappoint. But if there is a disappointment in the perception of people, that is possibly a means of increasing vaccine hesitancy rather than decreasing it. So I would just say that transparent communication from our political leaders is extremely important in making sure that vaccine hesitancy is kept at a minimum. Seth and Jane may have other things to add to that.
Anything? Okay, I'm going to go. Oh no, go ahead,
Seth's on
Jane.
I'll
mute.
just say one
No,
thing.
no, Seth's on mute.
Sorry. Just say one thing, which is, traditionally there's been less hesitancy in developing countries because people know the diseases and therefore they want to protect their families. Whereas in wealthy countries, vaccines have worked so well, the diseases are unknown and people can take them for granted. In this case, there has been a horrible coming together of conspiracy theories of different political groups that has led to what I think has been, in a sense, the worst statistics in terms of vaccine acceptance. But part of that is rightful fear because these vaccines have been rushed, as David has talked about, with such intensity that people are saying, are we cutting corners? Is this going to be? I think as soon as we see transparent information on review, as people start getting products and they see them being safe and they see them being able to return to some type of normalcy, I think that will help us a lot in moving forward. And I think now the social media companies are taking a different strategy, given that they've seen that they've been part of some of these terrible rumors and conspiracy theories, to try to do something about it. So hopefully all of this together can help us do it better, but we do have to be very concerned about it.
So that's a rather sobering note to end on. There's a lot at stake in this whole thing. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. And again, sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions. But Seth and Jane, thank you so much for joining us today for a really great discussion. I feel like we got some depth on the promise of Covax and the challenges and everything that's at stake here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Emma.
Absolute pleasure.
And thank you also to the audience for tuning in. Sorry we went a little bit over. We're not here next week, but in 2 weeks we'll be back with one of the key architects of Japan's coronavirus strategy, the virologist Hitoshi Oshitani, to see what can be learned from their experience. So wishing you all a great rest of the day. And thanks so much for joining us. And thanks again to Seth and Jane and to David.